All right, guys, thank you for those updates this morning. We'll talk to you one more time before we're done here for the day. Right now, we're going to welcome Blythe Brumleve, our social media queen, to the show to talk a little bit about how execs can give some better interviews. Blythe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. One more week until F3. Let's go.
One more week until F3, where hopefully a lot of people are going to be doing those interviews. You know, if you're not in a fireside chat, you're probably going to get tapped on the shoulder by someone with either a handheld camera or their phone saying, hey, let's do a quick little interview. As an executive, you want to be on your toes. You want to be ready, right? I want to hear some of your tried and true best interview tips for folks who maybe aren't used to being in front of a camera.
And so, as you mentioned, there are a lot of executives, especially in the freight and supply chain space, that are starting to do more interviews, and not really starting, but really over the last couple of years, they've started to really pivot into embracing a medium like this, where I'm at home, I'm in my office, I have a camera, I have a microphone. And so more and more executives are being asked to partake in different podcasts and different interviews. And what I'm seeing is not just experiencing on my own, but also experiencing by watching other people interview or take part in these interviews, is that they just need to make some minor improvements in order to really hit home of how, how great their product is or how great their service is. And so a few of the minor things, and that's just, starting off, things that you can control, things you can get, Amazon delivered within 2 days, is a microphone. One of those things is a microphone. A lot of executives are out here doing all of these interviews, and they're not thinking about the audio experience. They're too focused on maybe their surroundings. They're not focused enough on a little bit of their surroundings. Another good tip is to make sure you bring water, make sure you show up on time, make sure that you are in a quiet location, and make sure that you have good internet service, because a lot of these interviews are dependent completely on your internet service. And so when you're in the middle of answering a question and your signal goes out, what is the host of the interviewee supposed to be doing in order to guide that conversation? Because ultimately you want to make sure that this conversation hits home, not only for the person that you're talking to, but also for the at-home audience or the audience that's going to be listening in the future. So a few different minor things, but then also in the grander, sort of bigger picture scene, is thinking about your distribution plan of what you're going to do with that content after the fact. I think that is one of the more missed opportunities for a lot of executives.
And Blythe, can you talk to the aspect of really around planned interviews? A lot of times there's preparation. We already know subtle talking points that are going to be kind of had, but can you talk to the aspect of being able to just kind of answer those questions versus really reading the answers off a script? Because it seems like people can really certainly tell when there's like a overly rehearsed, polished answer versus, hey, I'm just sitting here having a conversation.
And so, yeah, it's a great point, because you can really tell when somebody is reading off of, a document that's in front of them, or maybe some note cards that they have on their lap, or even the notes app from the phone itself. And so when you think about, participating in an interview, a lot of times that we can get really nervous, and that's perfectly normal. But if you want to be prepared in the sense that you want to have a few bullet points, you don't want to have a full script that you're going to be reading off of, but having a few bullet points will help you be able to glance quickly at the screen and then glance back. And then that way, that next point that you really want to hit on. And then if you want to take it up even more of a notch, then you want to have a couple different stories to go with data points. Have 2 to 3 different stories plus data, using those two mechanisms to tell that story of how you want to get your point across, or how, the news topic of the day, or your product or your service, the things that you're really highlighting. Having those stories to tell around data will help the audience remember it so much more than just spouting off a bunch of numbers. If you can connect the dots between storytelling and the data that you're giving, percentages, stats, things like that, then that will really help that story resonate with the audience. And then in turn, a lot of times the audience will then reach out to that host or that show or that interviewer and tell them, oh, I really liked that guest. And that's a good sign to that interviewer to invite that guest on in the future. So you want to also be thinking about those next stories that you could be telling in the future, not just your one-time appearance.
Something that I think is really important and is really crucial, especially in today's day and age, is if you are going to put yourself in a public position as an executive, and you are going to say, even in a written statement, you should be at least some for folks to come back and ask, okay, I want to talk to you face to face about this, right? And even if you come prepared with a PR answer, you should at least start to be thinking about, some answers to maybe some hard-hitting questions, because they're going to come up no matter how well you prepare. There's always going to be that curveball question that your interviewer throws at you, right? Do you have any tips on folks who maybe aren't as comfortable in front of the camera or as comfortable kind of thinking on the fly to field some of those more difficult questions maybe that they hadn't prepared for?
I think that's a great question, because I think that that's one of those angles that you got to be really comfortable with saying you don't know, because the last thing you want to do is to give an incorrect answer or maybe a polarizing answer and to create that unnecessary, sort of controversy around what you said. So just simply, if you don't know the answer to a question, simply say it. I don't know the answer to XYZ, but I can offer you insight into this particular point. And so you kind of redirect the answer into something that you're a little bit more comfortable with answering, because you're not going to know everything, and that's okay. So in that sense, it's kind of almost that, everybody talks about being authentic online. That's a real quick way to sort of prove your authenticity, is by saying simply, I don't know, but I will find out the answer for you. And then that way you can follow up. And that's also a really good way to follow up with the audience or with that person later on in a social media post. Hey, I was asked about XYZ. I didn't know the answer at the time, but here is how I would respond to that now. You can do a quick 2-minute video, upload it to LinkedIn. There are lots of different ways that you can handle it, but the last thing you want to do is answer it incorrectly. So just embrace what you don't know and then do the steps in order to figure out the answer to that question if it's applicable to you and your business and the product or service that you're offering.
That's also a great way to drive traffic back to your site, right? If you're asked something about a technical aspect of a product or a specificity of a service that you answer, you say, you know what? Off the top of my head, I can't think of a way to sum this up, but if you head to our website at www.findyouranswershere.com, click our FAQs, you might be able to find it out, or you can request something like this, right? That's a really good traffic drive, and it'll help get you out of a jam in a situation, even if you can't think of something on the fly.
100%, because that's, I mentioned earlier about thinking about your distribution plan. And what I mean by that is when you're on these interviews like this, for example, what are you going to do with that video after the fact? Can you ask for a copy of it? Can you hire someone off of Upwork or Fiverr or maybe an executive assistant in order to help you edit those clips into something that's social media friendly? You want to add that full video to your website, to a resources section, to your blog post section. And then that way you have that as sort of a resource builder, so that when people do hear about your company, they come to your website, they can see that you've done interviews. It adds that additional trust factor, that authenticity factor, to your brand and to what you're trying to provide to your customers or potential customers. And so thinking about it in the larger scale of where am I going to put this interview after it's completed? Obviously social media, but you want to think about it in a little bit more of a strategic way where you can use that interview and publish the whole thing, but it goes a lot further when you can publish the whole thing to your website, and then you take that entire clip and then you digest those, or you split those up into digestible clips for social media. And then that way you can really play and really, hone in on the strength of that interview, even though it's only, maybe 10 or 15 minutes long. You can still splice that up into several different, 1-minute clips, 5-minute clips. And then that way you can use those as content to publish for a very long time to your social media channels, because you could publish those over and over again. It's not just like a one and done. It's one of those situations where, nobody remembers your content like you remember your content. So it's okay to republish, those different social media clips, but thinking about your larger distribution plan and how you're going to communicate that interview after it's done is probably more important than bringing or the interview itself.
And Blythe, when we're looking at these executives doing these interviews, do the rules change at all depending on how large your company is or how small your company is? Or do you really just keep the same energy and really represent your brand the same way?
I personally would represent my brand the same way. I'm going to be the same, conversationally wise in person as I would on an interview like this. But you do want to be conscious of, certain things that you don't want to comment on, or maybe you want to have a policy that you and your employees, or maybe your subject matter experts, if they're doing regular interviews, you want to have sort of maybe a blanket policy of, okay, we're not going to talk about politics. We're not going to talk about religion. We're not going to talk about those controversial, hot button issues. issues, not necessarily controversial, but people have polarizing opinions on those different subjects. And so you might want to have, and you might want to think about not just commenting on those as a whole, but if it's important to you as a company, then you should embrace it. And you shouldn't have any, I guess, sort of ill will on or talking about the things that you really believe in, but you just have to be careful that there's going to be a potential, somebody that's going to disagree with you, somebody that's really going to, I don't want to say cancel you, but there are, when you set yourself up to have conversations like that, you have to be prepared for the backlash. And not a lot of people are actually prepared to have that backlash. So it's just best case, just try not to talk about it. You're there to talk about your product, your service, your business, you as a person. And so unless it really affects, or unless it's really a story around those few things, then I would just steer clear of it.
All right, guys, thank you so much for being with us today, Blythe. It's great, as always, to hear from you. And, of course, we'll see you at F3. We're super excited about that. Safe travels, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Keep that same energy, Brumleve. I'm looking forward to it.
I know.
Amazing as always.
All right, we're going to head on over to Sydney Edwards. She's got our next check of top stories this morning.